All right. Welcome everybody to the FLOW seminar, where FLOW stands for Federated Learning One Word Seminar. And this is a seminar that was created to provide a global online forum for the dissemination of the latest scientific research results in all aspects of federated learning. It is organized by Peter Victorik, myself, Virginia Smith, Orlane Bellat, Dan Alistarh, and Sebastian Stech. And today is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, also one of our organizer, Dan Alistarh, who is a professor at IST Austria. And in his research, he focuses on high-performance algorithms that spans from algorithms and load bounds all the way to practical implementations. Before he joined IST, he was a researcher at ETH Zurich and also Microsoft Research in Cambridge. And today he's going to tell us more about the how to make federated averaging asynchronous and communication efficient. So thank you, Dan, and looking forward to your talk.
Thanks a lot, Dan, for the introduction. It's very nice to see that people are still attending FLOW in good numbers. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of our recent work on a variant of federated averaging, which is designed to be a bit more practical, in particular by supporting asynchrony and quantization. Okay, and this is joint work with Hossein Zakarinia, who's kind of the main author of the work, and then also Cheyenne Talaei and Georgi Nadiradze. So just in terms of motivation for our work, so we're obviously interested in this standard distributed learning setting where we have something that I'm going to call the central server, and then then a bunch of workers, and we can assume that the workers each have data, which is kind of the most precious commodity in this learning setup, and then they have different heterogeneous computational abilities, and they're willing to sort of collaborate with the server, which orchestrates some variant of a learning algorithm. Okay, so good. So I mean, this is a setup that all of you have seen, whether you've attended FLOW before or not. So it's extremely prevalent because you can map variants of standard parallel SGD to it, but also kind of federated learning. So we know a lot about this setup in terms of convergence rates, but also kind of potential for practical implementation and so on. And the interesting thing is that if you want to take the setup and map it onto a real system, there are a bunch of very natural sort of relaxations of consistency that you need to consider in order to make your system kind of a reasonable real world system. So first of all, we have to deal with the fact that the data at the client is heterogeneous. So basically, the data distributions may represent kind of some underlying reality, so they overlap to some extent, but they are different, and this might lead to difficulties in optimization. And then clients can take local steps. We cannot assume that clients will be able to communicate with the server at every possible step. Clients might have a limited communication budget that they want to spend on collaborating in our system. Therefore, we might need to compress these messages that are sent back and forth between clients and the system. And then another thing that's becoming very sort of popular for theoretical analysis these days is asynchrony, or what I'm going to call more generally client heterogeneity. So basically, what I mean here is the fact that the clients can move at different speeds. Okay, and then today's talk is going to be broadly motivated by the question of whether we can support all of these different relaxations jointly. And I mean, it's kind of already known that we cannot support them all in full generality. But then what we're going to try to do is kind of push a bit the limits of what's known here and say, okay, can we provide kind of reasonable assumptions under which we can support all variants of all four of these relaxations. Okay, so so good. So and so before I go to the next thing, I think there's a question, so maybe I'll try to take it. Okay, this is actually from Sam. Good. So good. So let me be a bit more precise by what I mean by heterogeneous federated learning. And here I'm going to just briefly describe a setup that if you've followed papers in this area, you're probably already familiar with. So for instance, I'm following pretty much the same setup as FedNova paper of Wang et al., which was one of the first ones to consider this. So basically, assume that we have n worker nodes and one coordinator. Each worker node will maintain will have a local distribution, which I call DI, and is able to compute unbiased stochastic gradients over its own distribution DI over arbitrary models. And we assume that the clients can actually store local models, which I'm going to call Xi, and they wish to the loss of a model over the local distribution is going to be called Fi. Okay, and then what I mean by data heterogeneity is that the local distributions are essentially different, but we will assume that they have some kind of bounded dissimilarity, which I'm going to formalize a bit later. And then at the same time, I'm going to assume that clients will make progress at different speeds, and these speeds might actually be sort of consistently different. So basically, someone who has a top-of-the-line smartphone might actually be able to compute more gradients per second than someone who has a very old phone, or someone who just doesn't want to contribute that much computation into our system. Okay, so then I'm going to consider a variance of federated averaging, which I'm going to describe a bit later in more detail. And then I would like to know to what extent federated averaging or its variance can converge in this setting, and what does convergence look like with respect to all of the consistency relaxations that I've just described. Okay, and of course, there has been prior work on this, so I will try to cover it, even though I will apologize in advance because you will probably not see some of your favorite papers in this overview just because of time constraints. So if we look at the asynchronous federated learning, so if we sort of forget about communication compression for a bit, then FedNova essentially told us that we cannot generally support both asynchrony and we cannot support both client heterogeneity, which is some version of asynchrony, and data heterogeneity without actually messing up our objective, because in the worst case, some of the slower clients, for instance, might have, or like very slow clients might have very important samples from our distribution. Therefore, we are actually going to have to end up with a different objective than what we might want. At the same time, there's been a lot of exciting work, and there's very recent work which I didn't get to cover, so I'm not going to cite it now. But basically, there are very exciting work on obtaining better bounds for asynchronous SGD under bounded delays, while still supporting some heterogeneity, even though not in full generality. Okay, so we're starting to find out more about this. And then on the practical side, there's a couple of algorithms, and I think one of the state-of-the-art ones is federated buffering, or FedBuff, which essentially are able to provide you with good sort of stable convergence under asynchrony and federated learning. Okay, so that's a very short overview of what's known on the asynchronous side with respect to federated averaging or its variance. Now, if we're interested in doing federated learning with communication compression, there's quite a long line of work on combining federated averaging, kind of the standard version, and adding communication compression via standard quantizers, such as stochastic unbiased quantizers like QHDD, or one-bit sort of quantizers, or error feedback, and so on. However, strangely enough, while doing the literature search, I realized that actually none of these references actually are able to provide like an end-to-end clean analysis of this. So as far as I could tell, all of these references, even though technically they're actually quite non-trivial, they still require non-trivial assumptions, such as gradient second moment bounds or some kind of exotic kind of gradient alignment assumptions in order to analyze both sort of the standard federated averaging setup and communication compression. And we're actually going to go back to we're going to see kind of a reason for this, a technical reason for this in about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. On the other hand, I think Peter Richter's team has been sort of taking a different look at this. And instead of looking at federated averaging, which is kind of a very practical, widely sort of adopted algorithm, they essentially tweaked the setup so that they plug in more complex and sort of better optimizers, such as variance reduction techniques and so on, which are able to sort of reduce the variance because of quantization, and therefore they're actually able to give very strong bounds. However, to implement these variance reduction techniques, sometimes we actually might need full gradients over the entire data, or I think this is a fairly constantly, we actually need synchronous communication to keep sort of the nodes in lockstep. So that's basically a brief overview of both asynchrony and communication compression. To my knowledge, there hasn't been significant work on combining these two at the same time. And again, we're going to see to some extent a rationale for that, why this is non-trivial a bit later. Okay, so just to summarize, what do we know? We know that federated averaging cannot generally support both data heterogeneity and client heterogeneity without running into stuff like objective inconsistency. So we will have to sort of relax at least asynchrony in the worst case to some extent in order to make some progress here on the algorithmic side. And then we know that there's actually quite a wealth of work on analyzing asynchrony and quantization, but somehow they've never been analyzed jointly. Okay, and then what's not clear is whether there's some kind of natural relaxation of full asynchrony, which will allow us to converge to reasonable, consistent objectives. Okay, and then the other thing that would be interesting is whether we could actually have a framework which allows us to analyze kind of all relaxations, local steps, asynchrony, quantization, whatever you would like in sort of inside the same algorithm, and whether that could lead to algorithms that are practical. Okay, so obviously this is kind of I'm sort of building towards some of the properties that our algorithm is designed to support. So basically, where we are proposing an algorithm that's called quantized asynchronous FL or QAFL, and I'll actually give you a good explanation for why it's called that. Once I start presenting it, but the point is, QAFL allows you to support heterogeneous data, some fairly natural, I would argue, partial nodes of asynchrony, and then quantize updates to pretty much whatever bitwidth you would like. Okay, and then what do I mean by partial asynchrony? So QAFL workers are allowed to take steps at their own local speeds, and they will have non-blocking communication with the server. So basically, the server does not need for them to ever sort of perform local work before they communicate back, which is kind of a mainstay of standard federated averaging. And our analysis works under general assumptions, so we do not need any sort of second moment bounds or something as strong as that. And we're also able to recover some of the best known bounds for federated averaging in some regimes. Obviously, since our algorithm is asynchronous, sometimes we're going to lose in terms of it. Okay, so we also implemented this algorithm in the Leaf benchmark, which is built on top of PyTorch, and we are actually showing that it can be competitive to federated, like to FedBuff, and on top of this, it supports communication quantization and without any issues. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. That's kind of our results, and now it's kind of a natural time to check if there are any questions. I don't see any questions.
Yeah, there are no questions in the chat, or I don't see any raised hands.
I mean,
everything was clear.
If you actually have any questions, you can ask now. Otherwise, I'll go ahead. Yeah, I mean, this was the easy part of the talk. This is when it gets a bit more complicated. All right, so okay, so what does this algorithm look like? Okay, so if you're a server which implements federated averaging, you want to switch to QAFL, at least for version 1, which doesn't include any quantization, you'll actually won't have to change anything or almost anything. Okay, so we assume you have a population of n nodes. These are the nodes here, and you have a single coordinator. And then, I mean, you could work with multiple coordinators. This is not. I'm just doing this for simplicity. And the coordinator holds this global model, which I'm going to call x_t. Okay. And then at every iteration, you kind of call around, and sort of what you're going to do is you're going to select S clients from your population, and then you're going to sort of ping them and say, hey, send me your latest progress. Okay, so basically you send your ping essentially contains sort of a notification saying, hey, I would like you're part of round X or round T, and then I would like to send you my current version of the model, which is this XT. And then please send me your local progress at this point. Okay, so and this local progress is essentially the sum of sort of local steps since the last communication to the server for the corresponding client. Okay, so again, very similar to what you would do in federated averaging or local HTTP. And then at the end of the step, you receive something from your clients, and we're going to discuss kind of what are the properties of whatever you receive, and then you're going to integrate this received progress into your global model, so that you don't do kind of the usual thing that you usually do, basically just kind of a step with respect to these summed updates, but we're actually going to do something that looks a lot like an averaging update. So basically, you're going to weigh your own server model by 1/s+1, and then you're going to take the average over all of the client progresses, and then you're going to average them into your next model, which into your sort of next iterate, which becomes xt or xt+1, if you will. Okay, so this looks very reasonable. It's pretty much the same as federated averaging, except for this slightly funny averaging step that we can discuss a bit later. Okay. Good. So from the point of view of the server, you could pretty much swap this in. However, from the point of view of the client, things are kind of more interesting, I would argue. So basically, again, we're in the standard federated averaging setup. So we have some kind of constant, which is called k, which is the maximum number of local steps you're going to take before you kind of communicate with the server, or actually before you stop, right? So a client between communications with the server can only take at most k steps, okay, at whatever local speed your device is able to do. And then you're going to maintain a local model, which I'm going to call xi here. And then you're also going to maintain some measure of local progress, which I'm going to call yi, okay? Good. So that's pretty much it. So basically, if you're a client, at some point a round starts, and then you start doing steps at whatever rate your device is able to progress. And at some point, what happens is that you get contacted by the server. So notice that the server doesn't really know where you are in your local computation. So it could actually contact you before the end of your k steps. And this is kind of an important property of Quaffle that you don't usually see in, let's say, in federated averaging. So basically, the server can interrupt you in the middle of your local steps. And the key thing is that you're immediately supposed to send the server your progress since its last communication. You're not going to try to finish your local step or finish all of your k steps. That doesn't happen in this case. You're supposed to send the server immediately, whatever progress you have, immediately. And this can lead to kind of awkward situations where you actually don't have any progress to send because you just communicated with the server, or your device is very slow or something like that. That's totally fine. This is kind of why the algorithm is kind of called Quaffle, because you're supposed to pass it. You're supposed to pass progress immediately when you get called by the server. Not you don't have to go all the way towards your goal of doing sort of k steps. Okay. So all right. So this is, so once the client communicates the local progress, it actually restarts its round. So first of all, sorry, it integrates the server's model locally. So we again have this slightly funny sort of averaging update as opposed to the standard update that we're usually doing, or in particular, clients do not directly adopt the client's model. Okay, and then we restart the local steps again as at your own local speed from the updated local model via this averaging step. So basically, once you're done, you kind of throw away whatever extra progress you were trying to make until k, and then you're going to start step 1 of your next iteration on top of this model. Okay, so that's kind of the client version of Quaffle, and as you can see, it's slightly different than the regular federated averaging. So in particular, one thing that we want to take advantage of here is that we are making communication non-blocking, in the sense that the server should not have to wait until the end of the client round in order to progress. Okay, so you immediately have to pass on the local progress, and then clients integrate server progress by averaging instead of directly adopting the client the server model. Okay, and then I said this before, but maybe I'll insist on it again because this is kind of an important property of Quaffle. the transmitted progress can be partial, and it's fine if the local progress at the step is 0. You just send 0. Okay. I mean, in some sense, you might as well not send anything, and then the server would kind of understand that you don't have any progress. Okay. So I'll check now if there are any questions, just because this is sometimes a bit harder to grok. Okay. It seems like people got it. So I'll try to give you kind of a high level sort of joint view of these two steps. So basically, assume we have a coordinator here, which is just running federated like some version of federated learning, or some instance of federated averaging. What does it actually look like for if it's running quaffle? So we have all of these 3 nodes, and notice that nodes 1 and 3 have kind of the same speed. I'm going to call it like 1 gradient per second or something like that. And then node 2 is slower and only contributes half a gradient per second. So basically, it will take it sort of double the time to do the step. Okay. So let's say the server, I mean, these clients have been running for a while, and the server wants to start round 1, let's say at this point over here. So it sort of contacts, it samples 2 clients out of the 3, just for the sake of the example. So then it's, let's say it samples randomly node 1 and node 2. Okay, notice that node 1 is already done with all of its k local steps. It already performed these 4 steps, so it was kind of idle when contacted. And then if you remember, the node is supposed to directly, immediately send its local progress to the server, which is kind of what happens. So in particular, node 2 here will send only half of its local steps, so it doesn't actually progress towards the end of its phase. And then the client receives these YTs, or sort of Y1, Y11, or Y12, and averages them to sort of produce XT, or the next XT, or XT plus 1. Okay, so this means that round 1 is done, except for the fact that now, like remember, we actually at this point, node 2 would have to restart its own local iteration from the servers, from the, like it integrates the server's model, and then it restarts this iteration from this model. Okay, so remember, I mean, that's kind of an important point in quaffle. You just restart once you've communicated with the server, and since this node here didn't get contacted, it is just idle because it has completed its steps way before the current round. It didn't get contacted, so there was no issue. Okay, so at this point, the coordinator starts round 2. Let's say it contacts node 2 and node 3. These are chosen randomly. And then notice node 2 and node 3, again, immediately are supposed to send their local progress, except that node 2 actually did not get to perform any progress. It sort of got pulled kind of too quickly again. So then it would have to send 0 or nothing. Okay, good. So I think there's a question. So let me see. Good. So I think there's okay. There's an excellent question, which was I was kind of expecting here. So I mean I will. So the question is about the bias of the model towards the data distribution of the faster devices. So there's essentially I mean there are kind of 2 analytical assumptions, or there's kind of one analytical assumption and one kind of algorithmic fix to this. So one thing that we're going to assume is that on average, so we're going to assume that the clients have, each client has some kind of constant speed. So therefore, like node 1, let's say here, it always is half slower, whereas the other ones are kind of have constant speed. Okay, so we're going to assume that in expectation, like whenever told, there is some kind of expected number of steps that the nodes have performed, and that this expected number of steps is greater than 0. So basically, we will assume that, I mean, it is totally fine if a node does not contribute at the step, but on average, each node should contribute something. Okay, so that's kind of the analytical assumption, which I'll make more precise actually on the next 2 slides. The other thing which we are doing on the algorithmic side is we're doing some kind of speed adaptive step size. So in particular, what we have is we're going to bias, we're actually going to adjust the learning rate corresponding to the faster clients. So we actually have some kind of nice baseline speed at which which sort of rebalances the objective. Otherwise, we would not be able to address this issue that you're pointing out. So I'll stop the hand waving now for now, and then I'll kind of explain the analytical assumption, and then maybe we can come back to your question. Is that okay? So we're assuming that this like the period at which the server pulls the updates is just like a fixed, it's sort of a fixed period, let's say. But that's, I mean, in practice, we actually play with that, and that doesn't matter too much. I mean, you have to assume that this is long, this period is long enough so that the server doesn't keep sort of interrupting clients. But in practice, you would be able to see that this is happening, so it wouldn't necessarily cause issues. All right, good. I mean, we can revisit this at the end. I mean, these are very reasonable questions. Good. Okay, so this is the kind of the global view of Quaffle. So I mean, the key idea here is that we would like to notice we're kind of like if you're just a client, your role in Quaffle is you're just trying to chug along and produce gradients on the sort of last version of the model, like corresponding to your last communication with the server. And at some point, if you are done, then you're done, and you don't need to contribute anything to the computation. Otherwise, if you are not done, if you can still, otherwise you just try to chug along. And the idea would be that we expect you, on average, to be able to contribute something. Otherwise, unfortunately, we cannot really take your data distribution into account. The interesting thing here is that this kind of computation process, which is kind of a baseline step happening over all nodes, is kind of decoupled from the server computation. So what's happening is that the server just asynchronously polls clients and kind of extracts their progress, causing them to restart, but the server doesn't actually have to wait or does not expect them to perform local steps once they have been pulled. Okay, so that's maybe the main difference from standard federated average. Okay, all right, so let's try to make sense of this in terms of something that we could analyze, because as I think as Mohammed was asking, like in the worst case, no one contributes anything, and therefore we don't have much to analyze. So from the point of view of the analysis, our assumptions are completely standard. So we're assuming that the local gradients, which I'm going to call GIT, are unbiased, and then that they're L-Lipschitz. In terms of gradient assumptions on the gradients, we're assuming a variance bound. So we're essentially assuming bounded variance, and then we're also assuming the standard like scaffold-like bounded dissimilarity assumption. So the existence of constants G and B such that the average gradient is bounded by this form. So this is completely standard. And then finally, from the point of view of progress, we're assuming that every node has, in some sense, its its inherent or intrinsic speed. Which means that given a certain period, like an expected period of time between pollings by the server, the client has this like number of steps hi, which is the expected number of local steps it will have performed during this period between two sort of polling steps by the server. Okay, and the only thing that we're assuming about this is that this is kind of constant per client. It could be completely different between clients. And this is going to be less than or equal to K by kind of the structure of our algorithm. We don't allow our clients to go beyond K. And then we're assuming that this is greater than 0. So basically, I mean, if you're a client, you cannot sort of provide any, contribute anything on average, then unfortunately, your device would be too slow to pretty much do anything. Good. So as I said, these sort of up to the progress assumption, everything is completely standard, and you can sort of view this as a kind of a probabilistic delay bound from the asynchronous perspective. Okay. Good. So all right. So what are we able to show? We're pretty much able to show very similar bounds to what you would get via federated averaging in this context. So basically, assuming the existence of these expected speeds and kind of a standard learning rate, which is n over square root of st, which is dampened by the minimum client speed. Okay, and for a proper parameterization of quantization, which we'll discuss later, and large enough sort of number of steps for this algorithm, what we're going to show, what we can show is that we have kind of this ergodic convergence of the sort of the gradient average over steps to sort of this first kind of first order step, which essentially gives us improvement in function value, which goes by 1 over square root of st. And then we have this sort of blue term and the red term, and I'm going to describe them briefly because I mean I know they look a bit scary, so I'm going to try to break them apart a bit, and we're going to try to see what they actually mean. Okay, so the first term is essentially what you usually expect for the analysis of federated averaging with respect to t, the number of steps, and the sampling rate. Okay, so this is kind of the pretty much the number of gradients that you've seen so far, assuming t rounds. Okay, so we're getting in some sense optimal convergence with respect to this term. And then in the second term is usually where things like the gradient variance and the local number of local steps come in. So notice that we are we have two terms here. So I'm just going to focus on the first one that's bolded. So the interesting thing here is that we are actually able to reduce the variance by a factor which is proportional to the total number of nodes and is weighted by some kind of weighted combination of the node speeds. Okay, and for instance, if we assume that the speeds are equal, we actually get linear speed up with respect to the number of local steps, which is kind of the best you could achieve in this case. However, we also have this very interesting dissimilarity term, where we essentially have this g square term, which was sort of introduced in the difference in the definition of bounded dissimilarity. And the very interesting thing here that this still goes down by 1 over square root of st. However, we are only able to reduce it by a factor that's sort of proportional to the minimum sort of node speed, which is actually quite natural because you can only sort of reduce the similarity by a factor that's proportional in the speed of the slowest node. Because in some sense, the important samples could be actually located on this node, and therefore, in the worst case, there's not much more you would be able to do. So just to check, one thing that one can check if there's time, you can actually set all of the speeds to be equal, and then you'll actually get kind of proper sort of linear convergence speed with respect to the number of with respect to this kind of constant local speed, which is very nice. And then we have this pretty ugly third term. The sort of numerator of this looks very similar to what we have here. We also have this kind of pretty ugly polynomial terms, which are kind of the nuisance terms because of asynchrony and quantization. However, the key trick here, or like the key actually technical sort of mechanism here, is that this is divided by t, the number of steps, as opposed to square root of t. So by following kind of standard asymptotic analysis, we can claim that this term is negligible, assuming that our number of rounds is large enough with respect to number of nodes. Okay, so overall, we kind of, I would claim we get sort of the best possible convergence for federated averaging type algorithms with respect to this term, and I would say also this term, even though I'm not sure if I'm able to prove a lower bound for this term specifically. And then this other sort of nuisance term is small enough asymptotically that it should not matter. Okay, so good. So I've described sort of the asynchrony part of Quaffle, and then I've also shown you some kind of high level of the analysis. So let me try to tell you a couple of things about why quantization is kind of non-trivial in this setup. So one thing to kind of notice, and this is kind of what's happening in the analysis of these prior works that try to combine federated averaging with quantization, is that unfortunately using just a standard quantizer, such as stochastic dithering or something like that, would not work for a very simple reason. So the quantization error of a standard quantizer usually depends on the norm of whatever it is you're sending. However, in federated averaging, you're sending, for instance, the server is sending its model. The norm of the model is not necessarily bounded because essentially our iterate could be anywhere. Therefore, we could have sort of unbounded quantization error. There are ways to sort of get around this, but they require either additional memory or sort of bounded norm assumptions, essentially second moment bound assumptions, which is kind of why you see the second moment bound assumption to be fairly popular in these prior works. So what's interesting is that we're able to get around this, and we do not need this kind of second moment gradient bound or pretty much anything non-standard by using a different type of quantizer, which is what I'll call a positional quantizer. So basically, this is a quantizer whose error only depends between the distance of whatever it is you're sending and some kind of reference point, which is located at the receiver. So basically, whenever the receiver gets the message, it's able to kind of decode the message with respect to its local iterate, usually. And this is kind of the trick that we're showing here. Unfortunately, or I mean, fortunately from our analysis, we actually need to show that the sort of local models are tight enough in order to be used at correct decoding points between the server and the client. Okay, so what does kind of whole quaffle look like from the point of view of the client? So again, we have exactly the same setup as before, except that we're actually going to quantize our like the server messages and the client messages while they're being sent. So basically, whenever you're sampled by the server, you actually receive kind of an encoded quantized version of its model. And then you send it kind of an encoded version of your progress. And then before you're able to integrate the server's progress, because I mean, you cannot interpret it if you cannot decode it, you actually will decode it using this positional quantizer using your local model as the reference point. And then you restart the k-local steps and so on, okay? So the server does exactly the same thing, but on the reverse side. So it actually decodes the client model with respect to its own. And then we will need to show analytically, and this is kind of a completely different part of our analysis, which needs to show that this decoding is always correct, which is not so trivial. Okay, and then the other thing that's happening in full quaffle, and this goes back to the question I got before, is in these kind of local steps, we have some kind of added dampening factor corresponding to the client's local speed. So that then this allows us to keep a homogeneous objective. So for this, I'll actually point you to the paper to sort of see the details, or you can ask questions in the Q&A afterwards. All right. So the analysis works by kind of a bit differently from maybe what you've seen for federated and averaging analysis, because instead of actually showing that the server model directly converges, what we show is that the average over all models converges. So basically, we define this potential, which is kind of the average. It's kind of the model variance over all of the models, including the client models and the server models. And then we show that this is well bounded by some kind of fairly complex analysis. So basically, what I mean by this, so I mean that in expectation, this potential actually has some super martingale-like behavior. So it kind of increases in expectation because of sort of randomness, such as gradient variance, but it can be controlled by performing local steps and also by the learning rate that we choose. And and once we have this kind of bounded notion of progress, we essentially show that all models cannot be too far from each other. This helps us in the quantization because we can sort of use them as decoders, but also we can use them in a kind of noisy HDD type of analysis, because what we're showing is that gradient nodes take gradients not with respect to the sort of proper points, but with respect to points that are just sort of slightly shifted from, or like boundedly shifted from the kind of actual virtual iterate, which corresponds to this mean. Okay, so all right, I've shown you this variant of federated averaging, which has this kind of non-blocking type of communication, supports quantization and this type of partial asynchrony that we've been discussing, and at least in theory, it should show us some speed up in relevant regimes. What we lose in theory is we need this kind of assumption on the total number of runs. They kind of need to be sort of larger than a specific factor in n for this whole process to mix. Okay, we haven't noticed that this is necessary in practice, so this might be an implementation of our analysis. And then the dependency in K is, I think, a bit poorer than I think some of the best known dependencies I've seen in the literature, but I think those are analyses which specifically focused on this dependency. And again, this is something we might be able to improve ourselves. Okay, so I'll show you some practical results and then wrap up unless there's any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions. So, all right, so let me show you some practical results. Good. So what we want to show is that in a setting where we have heterogeneous clients, so basically clients that work at different speeds, then and working over heterogeneous data, we can actually get reasonable speedups, reasonable practical speedups. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to study what happens with the convergence of our algorithm with respect to sort of standard federated averaging, but also what happens when we tweak different parameters such as ns, the number of local steps and number of bits. And then we'll also do kind of a more realistic implementation and compare against FedAvg. Okay. So to do this, as I said, we implemented Quaffle in PyTorch in the kind of standard setup of this of the Leaf federated benchmark. And we ran it on settings of up to 300 clients and compared against various baselines. So what do I mean by heterogeneity in this case? So we're going to assume a fixed data split, which could be either heterogeneous or homogeneous. And then we're going to assume that we have two node types. One would be sort of fast nodes, whose speed would be, let's say, 1 gradient per second, and slow nodes, which have whose speed is like 1/4 of a gradient per second. So it would need four times as many steps to get a gradient through relative to the fast one. Okay, and then the interesting thing, I mean, we sort of set up the server interaction times and so on, such that nodes still have, like fast nodes have a good probability of providing progress, but then kind of about 1/4 of the time, slow node has actually not made any progress when contacted by the server. So this would be a fairly choppy, let's say, setup from this point of view. So the server actually gets a non-trivial number of zero progress messages. Okay. And we are going to use them for standard tasks in Leaf, so such as training ResNets for image classification and on a bunch of data sets for which we have heterogeneous splits. Okay, and then we're, unless otherwise stated, we're going to run the asynchronous quantized variant of the algorithm with a number of local steps that's fairly reasonable, like between 2 and 10. Okay, all right. So the first question is, can we converge faster than federated averaging? At least, I mean, that should be a very reasonable thing to ask from an algorithm. So here we implemented kind of a parallel SGD baseline with sort of equivalent batch size and a version of federated averaging. And we look at the loss and the validation accuracy with respect to time in our Leaf simulator. Okay, and then what we notice is that, I mean, all three versions of the algorithm are kind of independently tuned, so they all converge reasonably well. But what we noticed is that Quaffle actually does much better in terms of convergence versus sort of wall clock time. And this is because it doesn't have to wait at all for the round to close, whereas both federated averaging and sort of standard minibatch SGD would actually have to wait for each node to sort of send its local probe. Okay, so and this holds both from the point of view of loss decrease over time and from the point of view of accuracy over time. So I think to sort of hit top accuracy, I think we have a pretty reasonable speed. Okay, so so we're faster in terms of wall clock time. This is not necessarily surprising because this is a setup where I mean, we were trying to sort of improve federated averaging, so it makes sense that we have managed to hit this mark. Okay. Now, in terms of ablations over sets of parameters, the first thing to sort of look at is confirmation that we actually get faster convergence with respect to S, the number of sample clients. And this is what you see here. So loss decreases much faster as you increase the number of sample clients from 10 to 40 on a system with 100 nodes. So that's again pretty nice. And then we also looked at the impact of the sort of bit rate. So we noticed that sort of 8 bits for the example. I think this is a Salabé example where it's fairly heterogeneous. So I think 8 bits is, I mean, provides convergence, but not as fast as the version with 10 bits or 32 bits. But notice that after 10 bits, there's a kind of a phase shift. So it doesn't really matter if you increase number of bits. Okay, and then we also noticed, I mean, a fairly natural question if you start thinking about it is like, what if you actually don't do averaging locally, but you actually do adoption, direct adoption of the client model or of the client model average or of the server model. And notice that in fact, what are so basically the version that does averaging, this averaging step both on the client side and on the server side is actually the one that performs the best by far, I would say. So it does kind of motivate our analysis. For instance, I don't think we are able to analyze the versions which only do kind of one side averaging. But I mean, they're kind of, it's reasonable to ask. I mean, these are in some sense variants of federated averaging, so they could be analyzed. But it does suggest that our version in some sense sort of makes sense and works the best. Okay, and then okay, so we nothing unusual happens here. We sort of see the reasonable things you would expect from an ablation. Now, the last thing I want to show you is what happens if you compare with FedBuff. So basically, we are running against FedBuff in pretty much the same setup. It's a heterogeneous setup. And here, this is a setup where FedBuff kind of suffers a bit, because what FedBuff does is it actually adopts the gradients as they're kind of received. And if you're in a heterogeneous setup, this means that some slow clients will be very slow to contribute gradients. So it will actually start going, in some sense, into the direction of the fast clients because it doesn't really protect against this. And I think these are kind of the reasons for these kind of spikes that you see in the convergence of the algorithm. Eventually, all algorithms converge. It's just that in the case of FedBuff, it might actually take a lot more. As you can see, our progress is much smoother. I believe that this is literally because we're allowing even partial sort of slow client progress. Therefore, our objective is kind of more homogeneous on average. Okay, and this also kind of has two versions for each algorithm. So basically, we have the version with quantization, which you see is slightly slower than the version without quantization, which is the orange one here. And then we also try to integrate QSGD with FedBuff. Unfortunately, the lattice quantization doesn't actually make sense, so it wouldn't work. But we try to implement QSGD with FedBuff. It seems like it doesn't diverge, but it doesn't look like it's converging very well either. Right? So we were just trying to see if it's something that would be reasonably feasible in practice. Okay, and then we also try to do quantization, like QSGD quantization with waffle, and it works about as well as you would expect, which is not very well. Okay, good. So so we have noticed that at least in these heterogeneous settings, we are actually a bit better than FedBuff, and I mean this kind of again makes sense. All right, so thanks for sort of sticking around until now. So what I've been talking about so far is that I think it's kind of interesting that we can implement a version of federated averaging which does support heterogeneous data, and this kind of notion of partial asynchrony together with communication compression with speedups in some regimes, so we can actually track the sort of some of the best known federated averaging bounds, such as the ones you can find in scaffold. So I think one thing I'm kind of happy about with respect to Waffle is that it does allow clients to participate in this kind of best effort mode. And it does reduce the load on the server, which doesn't have to wait anymore. So as long as there's progress on average, we can take advantage of this progress with respect to Quaffle. I think the analysis technique is kind of interesting because it can sort of support all of these different relaxations in conjunction. And then in terms of further work, I think I would be quite interested in seeing whether this kind of bounded dissimilarity term is provably sort of unimprovable, so to say. And then I'd also be interested in seeing what happens under large-scale deployments and sort of seeing how our results relate to these kind of notions of full asynchrony that are being analyzed these days. All right. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for the excellent talk. So please, if you have any questions, just post your question to the chat or just raise your hand. I already see there is a question by Alexander at the chat. So I'll try to unmute Alexander. And
Hi.
Hey, yeah, you can repeat your question if you want.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the talk. Yeah, and so my question is similar to Mohammed. So I'm wondering if the data that you evaluated your experiments on, especially I think the last few slides where you showed this heterogeneous data, this is what the question is about. Like, how big was the class imbalance on the particular peers? Because in my experience, like from what I gather or understand, like from Quaffle, is that you may basically just skip out on a few clients, right, where data is basically not processed yet, and therefore you only evaluate or use the gradients from the faster clients. And my experience, like, that can lead to very bad local minima, especially at the start of the training. And so I'm coming from distributed deep learning field, so not really federated learning. And for us, I have like typically I have a few epochs where I simply try to add all the gradients from all the peers, regardless how long it takes. And only after a few rounds have happened, only then I start to kind of loosen the bounds and allow asynchronous training.
I mean, I think that's a very, I think that's a very good question. So I can maybe try to answer it in two different ways. So first, to be a bit more precise about the setup in which these experiments were obtained. So in particular, here, this kind of heterogeneous setup, this is on Cella Bay, and this is the striping, like the distribution is done per class. So basically, specific node will get like a specific class, or we essentially do some kind of mapping. I think that Cella Bay has like a fairly fine-grained sort of class mapping or attribute mapping. So we can literally partition the classes across clients. So it is, I mean, I don't think this could be called catastrophic, but it is problematic, as you can see what from what happens with respect to FedAvg. So basically, it's much worse than what you would get if you did like a fixed random data shuffle. I would actually be very interested in seeing what happens in more realistic settings with this in this case. But I think so if from our point of view, I guess what would happen is if you're kind of the server and you're implementing this, you're seeing that you don't see certain classes essentially, or like you're not seeing data from certain clients because they're always kind of getting pulled before they're actually able to do local steps. You could actually increase your server interaction time in kind of initially. Because notice that what happens is that the fast clients go up to K steps and they stop there, they become idle. And then this would give more time to the slow clients to actually commit local steps. Okay, so that is something that could be adjusted for in the algorithm. As I said, like our evaluation is kind of an academic evaluation, so we haven't really gone very deep into sort of very detailed kind of adversarial setups or like sort of stringent heterogeneous setups for this. But it's a very good point.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the answer. So I actually typed out the question even before you showed those slides, so I was very surprised to actually see these results. So yeah, pretty amazed that it can handle that.
I mean, the other thing is, like, notice we're not completely skipping slow client data, right? So we are skipping it about 30% of the time, I would say, in this setup. So it clearly is kind of imbalanced, but at the same time it's not completely not completely skipped, in which case we would probably reproduce your observations.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a relaxation in that sense, so it kind of helps a little bit, right?
Yes, and I mean, and this is something that you can control with a parameter of the server. So I think it might be actually interesting to see what happens, because basically you would lose performance because the fast clients would be idle for longer, but otherwise you would not be losing much.
Yeah, it's a very interesting trade-off in terms of time versus accuracy then, right?
Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any questions now in the chat, or there are no raised hands, but I can ask. In the meantime, I would have two questions. So first, can you actually like one thing that I was wondering is, can you relax your assumption about like the expected time that it takes for like a client to compute to something like more similar that kind of FedNova had, that you kind of adjust your weights based on actually how many actual steps they are able to, like the clients that are able to take, and then like kind of reweight that such that you don't have any bias? Would that be possible in your setup?
some sense, I mean, in some sense, this is actually what the algorithm is doing. So it is rebalancing towards so the kind of the average magnitude of the update is sort of balanced among clients. So I mean, this is something we're kind of already doing. I mean, we're benefiting from the fact that we have this kind of upper bound on the maximum number of steps that have been taken, which is this kind of K as well. So a fast client cannot go arbitrarily sort of far.
But can you actually, like, for instance, like if you will have a client now, I mean, I guess like in the middle of a training, suddenly like switch the speed, that your algorithm would be able to adjust to that, like without actually,
yes.
like without knowing,
This
kind of
is
have
actually
running mean. Yeah.
So this is actually quite interesting. So basically, the clients are actually doing this themselves. So the server doesn't actually have to know the client's speeds. So, I mean, this is something that would be better explained on the algorithm, so maybe we can follow up afterwards. But this is actually, this can be implemented at the client itself. So basically, all the clients need to know is like the minimum speed, which can be maintained by the by the server. And then each client is kind of adjusting its own learning rate corresponding to its own local speed at this point. So the server doesn't need to orchestrate this. So so again, like this balancing is kind of happening by itself. I actually and I mean in the new version of the paper, which should be posted, or should have been posted, or should be posted today, you'll actually see we have some ablations with respect to kind of what happens if you don't rebalance versus rebalancing, and you'll actually see sort of the conversions difference.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see. Yeah, maybe one more question about, like, do you have from your I didn't notice, but do you have like a optimal K that might be that might optimize the convergence rate? Or how to select that?
So I think, I mean, the best, I mean, there is kind of a naive answer to your question, which is like the best thing that could happen is if all of the speeds are equal and they're equal to K. Like basically in that case, we actually pretty much recover federated averaging with K. So this is actually kind of a part in the discussion. I don't think we've computed kind of the optimal K relative to a fixed speed, because I mean, you get kind of weird formulas. I don't know if you've noticed this. So for instance, we get this kind of weird weighted mean, which looks a bit like the harmonic mean. So I don't think we've actually gone into seeing like what would be the optimal K to sort of minimize this term. So I mean, that's a good question, but we haven't really looked into it. But for instance, like if you take all of the H's to be equal, and equal to K, then this K would disappear and you would get sigma square over NK, which is kind of the optimal thing you could obtain in this case. Your variance goes down with the number of nodes and with K sort of linearly. So which is kind of the best you can expect for the number of gradient steps that you're generating.
Okay, thank you. And let me see. Okay, so we're maybe been out of time. Let me see whether there is maybe one quick question. Okay, so let me maybe ask the last one. So last thing I was kind of wondering about, is it also that you could kind of employ different quantization per client? Like for instance, assuming that it's not only like a compute is a problem, but also like a communication is a problem. That they cannot actually immediately communicate, but they kind of take time, and you have heterogeneity there.
I think the answer is yes. just because of the way in some sense, we're doing that in the analysis for the speeds anyway. So we could actually take that into account. I mean, you would just get like a super nasty sort of formula.
I guess like something average that's like the precision of quantization and the speed, right?
I think that's actually that's a kind of a cool thing we'll look at, just because it would be kind of interesting to see, like, you know, you have a like powerful phone, but you're on a data plan or something like that. That could be quite interesting. But I think you would get very similar trade-offs here, basically. Right now, I mean, the just for some context, I sort of phrased this bound without putting the parameterization of the quantization in, just so it's kind of easier to follow for people. But like in the paper, we actually have the full sausage where you can sort of analyze each term in isolation. All right. Good.
Right,
thanks a lot for all of the questions, and thanks a lot for the experience. It was nice to give a talk at Flow as always.